up on this week's show, we look back on the best in retro of 2024. And the Retro Hour podcast has been brought to you every Friday all throughout the year, thanks to our incredible sponsor, Bitmap Books. Now, have you seen their latest volume? Maybe everyone in your family is asking, what do you want for Christmas this year? Little idea for you, the Game Boy Advance Pixel Book. Now, this is a real celebration of Nintendo's 2001 handheld console, covering all the big titles on there. Legend of Zelda, Minish Cap, Advance Wars, Final Fantasy Tactics, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, Castlevania, lots more as well, spanning more than 300 pages with 4,000 screenshots of over 240 titles that defined the Game Boy Advance. So you can check that out and have a look at the rest of their retro gaming collection. They've been big supporters of this podcast all throughout 2024. Head to bitmapbooks.com. And with our lovely friends at PCBWay. Now, maybe you're working on something over the Christmas break. You know that PCBWay offer fully featured custom PCB prototyping, low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and if you're looking for services like 3D printing and injection molding, definitely worth checking them out. And of course, you know, they've been big supporters of our podcast and the retro community in general all throughout 2024. So get an instant quote right now and check out their shared project section of their website as well. Head to PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 459, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to the podcast, a show that all throughout the year, every single Friday, has of course been bringing it up to speed on all the big happenings in the wonderful world of retro gaming and technology, and bringing you veterans of the industry onto the podcast every single week for a catch-up and a bit of a in-depth history on the titles they worked on, the companies they were at, and lots more as well. And we have reached that episode where, definitely not the filler episode before Christmas. We always have to point that out. This is, in fact, a celebration of the Retro Hour and the guests that we've had on throughout the last year. And I don't know about you guys, it feels like this has just kind of come out of nowhere. How on earth is it the end of 2024 already?
It's crazy. It's such a habit, you know, making this podcast.
Yeah.
It all just blends into one huge thing with me. And I just absolutely love some of the guests we get on as well. And like, we've had to pick some guests for this week's show, you know, some of our favourites. And there's so many that I want to do two of these shows, because I'm like, this year we've had some absolutely killer ones.
You know, we were saying that, so we've got a little Facebook group that we chat in. And, you know, we don't like to be too self-congratulatory, but that's, you know, kind of the idea of this episode, isn't it? That we kind of look back and celebrate the guests, really, that we've had on throughout the last year. And we're saying, you know, bearing in mind this podcast has been going almost a decade now. It will be our 9th birthday next month. The fact that we're still getting guests of such incredible quality and such a high standard. I mean, you know, a lot of people thought that we'd fizzle out after the first few months, including, you know, I'll be honest, I didn't know that we could keep it going this long. But, but I mean, yeah, the fact that we're looking through this guest list, and actually I found it really hard this year just to pick 5 of my favourite moments from the podcast. I don't know how you felt, Joe.
Yeah, man. Just reflecting on what you just said, and kind of like reflecting on yesterday when I was trying to pull all my clips together, and I was looking at all the episodes I've been on this year, you know, interview-wise, and it's like you say, we're 9 years into this, and sometimes I maybe I take it for granted, you know, how amazing the guests all are, and it's just like, you sit there and you're just like, these are the games I grew up with. Like, there's so many games that I actually grew up with this year, or even kind of like celebs, if you will, like Jason Bradbury and stuff, like people I grew up watching as well. On TV and stuff like that. And it's just like, sometimes you're just like, yeah, man, like, it sounds so big-headed, like, but it's just like, yeah, man, like, this is amazing. And, you know, I tell people at work about it and stuff, and they're just like, oh, God, you spoke to that guy. And you're just like, yeah, man. And like, how did you get hold of them? And like, we emailed them. Yeah. we asked. Like, with
Ravi's nicely worded emails.
Yeah, Ravi's nicely worded emails, get them on. But, yeah, it's just crazy to think, you know, how it's gone so quick. But, you know, it's thanks to the guests, thanks to the listeners for listening in every week and everything. Like, it's amazing, man.
I think we've changed direction a little bit, which has actually helped Joe quite a bit, because the systems that we've been going into, we've been doing a lot more PS2 stuff, I've kind of noticed. Yep. And we've started to kind of get into that console-y area, as well as we're going really 8-bit this year as well. We've had some real kind of 8-bit systems that we've not covered that much before. And we've got these interesting tech episodes as well that we do. It's not just retro gaming. We've got some interesting explorations into tech as well. And a lot of the time it's like, you get someone on that we just find interesting and put it on. And, some people like, oh, I'm going to skip that episode, or I'm not going to do that. But then other people listen to it and they're like, oh yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I didn't expect, that guest to be talking about this, or some of the connections that you get with other guests as well. It's quite interesting, the approach to it, I think. And I could definitely see Joe's had a lot more this year, especially when we've covered stuff like, BioShock, and we've been covering like Alien Hominid and stuff like that.
That's why I think we work well as a team as well, because we have all got different interests. I mean, you mentioned like some of the tech episodes we've done, and I mean, you guys know that I'm a retro gamer. I love that, but I'm equally at home, messing around with an old version of Windows. I enjoy that as much as playing a classic
operating
game.
Systems and Amigas. Exactly, if it was you and me.
Yeah, I think it has been another amazing. I say at the end of the day, I mean, we're all us guys are the biggest fanboys of the people we get on, aren't we? So hearing their stories, and it's we never take for granted that we get to talk to, like you said, Joe, kind of our childhood heroes on the podcast every week.
I love the feedback from everyone that we get when we put an episode out, and even people that don't usually comment just come out and pop out and comment and say, oh, I really enjoyed this one. And doing that, patrons meet up and after hours as well. Yeah, has been really nice to see everyone and kind of actually go out to events and see people and bump into them in real life has been amazing.
Well, we're thinking back on that, weren't we? We're talking before we started recording. Again, we've met several listeners and patrons of the podcast who we've only seen before on like a screen, or maybe in an email or Discord or something. Actually meeting people in person when we went to Retro Messa in Norway. Ravi, you and I were out there for their 10th anniversary back in the summer. And that, we're part of the furniture there now, aren't we? Pretty much at Retro Messa.
Yeah, I did the Kickstart event in Nottingham, the Amiga one, and that was like a little bit of a patrons meetup as well, wasn't it? Yeah. And I went out and saw Tommy in Sweden and stuff, and been up to Scotland, and been all over, and it's just really nice meeting people and having people come up and say, oh, I listen to you every week, and you're like, oh, really? Oh.
Yeah. And it's crazy. One of the biggest buzzes, I think, for me of 2024 was when we were in Norway. The amount of people that came over and were like, oh, would you mind signing a copy of your book? And they actually had like the book that we wrote in their hand.
I thought you were going to say was the biggest buzz was the Jägermeister in Norway.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that goes without saying, obviously. You normally get a bigger buzz because I hand mine to you. But yeah, it's just, the fact that the books have been making it into people's hands this year as well. More and more people are getting hold of those. There are still a few left, actually, if you're quick. If you head to theretrohour.com, hopefully getting under the shipment of those over from Germany at some point in the new year as well. So, I mean, it's just been an all-round incredible year. And I want to thank, not only all the amazing guests that we've had on, of course, everyone who's listened to the podcast, all of our patrons, all of our sponsors, and you guys as well. And I mean, people obviously know that we enjoy doing the podcast, but, fitting in a weekly podcast every single week around day jobs and family, it is a big commitment. So I think in terms of a team, a little pat on the back, lads. I think we've done another great job in 2024. So why don't we celebrate the real stars of the podcast? That is, of course, our incredible guests who we have on every week. And if you haven't heard the best of episode before, the way this works is we pick 5 of our favourite moments from different guests across the year. And like you said, we've had quite a variety of guests on the podcast this year. So I think it's going to be quite a varied hour coming up, hour or so, as we look back on some of our favourite moments of the year. And if you guys will give me the pleasure of kicking it off this year, because one of my favourite guests that we had in 2024 was the wonderful Tara Hernandez. Now, she was a project lead at Netscape and then into Mozilla. You mentioned before, Ravi, that we've done like a few more kind of techie episodes this year. And I mean, that was kind of one of the things I'm really into at the moment. I'm really into internet history really interests me right now. And I think it's probably because we're kind of getting, like you said, we're doing a lot more guests from like the mid-90s kind of onwards. And I think about my personal history then, like 95, 96, that was when I was first getting on the internet. And I remember using Netscape. Navigator was the first ever browser I used on these mysterious 4 computers that appeared after one summer holiday in the school library, and no one really used apart from me.
And the browser wars as well, which is a great kind of era to cover. Like I'm sitting here with a Netscape Navigator theme on Chrome at the moment.
Nice. You'll have to send me that.
Absolutely love it, yeah.
Well, Tara Hernandez actually went into all that, and I mean, it was one of my favourite episodes of the year. And in this little clip here, she kind of reflects on what it was like in that era, in Silicon Valley, late 90s, kind of her unexpected kind of indirect path into the world of online and web browsers. And, she worked at Borland originally, and then kind of embracing that. Netscape almost had a bit of a quirky kind of campus culture, didn't it? It was a bit like, those kind of the geek houses that we see on like documentaries and movies and that kind of thing too. A lot of partying going on, usually in the office as well. And the fact that she's talking in this clip about her introduction to the world of technology companies at the time and working those legendary 120-hour work weeks to get Netscape out the door. I mean, had you used like Mosaic, and were you familiar with the web before you went there?
Not a thing. A thing. Yeah. So there's a woman, her name is Joy Lenz. She's amazing. I've worked with her at I think 3 companies. She keeps saying she's going to retire, and then she gets bored and goes off and, joins another startup. But she called me and she said, "Hey, you want to come work at Netscape?" And I'm like, "I do." She says, "Yeah, you really do. You got to get out of Borland and come work at Netscape. I'll get you an interview." I'm like, "Okay." So I went and I interviewed. It was a very chaotic place. I mean, there's people running around and barefoot, and I mean, it was like a frat house. It was very strange because Borland was a pretty well established company, much more traditional at the time, traditional high tech, the IBM sort of style of the pocket protectors and the button down shirts. But Netscape was a madness, and but I ended up joining, like, because I was young and dumb and didn't have any better ideas of what to do with my life. But she had to explain everything to me. She's like, "Okay, so you need to start by this date." So this was July of 1995. She had called me. So I'd done the interviews, and I'm about to, everybody's been leaving, right? Borland, gone off to Microsoft or wherever. So there's very few of us left. And I'm like, "Joy, I got to ship these products. I'm going to feel like a complete heel if I leave before I ship this. I'm the one who does all the floppy disks."
Yeah.
And she says, no, you have to start on this date. I think it was like August or July 31st, something like that. It was like the last week of July. But because I'm an idiot, I basically worked 2 jobs. So I would get up, I would get to Borland at 6 o'clock in the morning. I would work until 3, and then I would drive over the hill to Mountain View, and then I would start working at Netscape, where it turns out I also had a product to ship. They're like, "Hey, the Windows version 1.2 has got to go out. Can you take care of it?" I'm like, okay. So I wrote an installer and built Golden Masters in the first week I was there. And I didn't sleep. It was absolutely nuts. But then I found out the reason she made me do that was because the following week, that was the last week I could have joined and been part of the IPO.
Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely talk about the IPO because that was, the biggest in tech history at the time. But I'm interested, when you first joined Netscape, I mean, do you remember the interview and who did that and what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, they had not hired full-time build engineers yet. They were just kind of like, the developers were just sort of getting by. And then when Joy hired on, and she was hired to run the QA department, and she said, "Why don't you have any build engineers or release engineers?" And they're like, she's like, "Okay, I know some people." And that's when she called me. So she interviewed me, but she already knew she wanted me to come. She had me talk to a couple of people who did not know how to interview. And then the one interview I remember was by the late Tom Paquin. He was an industry veteran by that point, had been around at a lot of different companies. And I remember he asked me a question. He goes, here at Netscape, we work pretty hard. I'm like, "Do you think you can work hard?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, sure. Why not?" Like, I put in some late nights at Borland when we needed to. He goes, "Well, what's a late night for you?" And I said, most people would work 9 to 5, and I would stay till 7 sometimes, if we needed to. And he started laughing at me. He goes, "Well, you'll learn." He says, and I don't think he actually really cared that much, but I think he knew to keep an eye on me at that point, because there was a 7-month period in the lead up to when we created Mozilla.org where we were working 120-hour weeks. Like, we weren't going home.
Wow.
Right. And that was a pretty common thing that happened on the regular at Netscape. It was absolutely, in retrospect, at my age now, looking back, I'm like, that was the most ridiculous, unhealthy thing ever.
Yeah, and I think, Ravi, you joined me on that episode, and hearing those stories, I mean, like you said, the browser wars and what it was like going up against Microsoft as well. It was definitely a David and Goliath story, wasn't it?
We got so excited about browsers. I think Joe was like, what is going on here?
Nerds.
Yeah, I think that was a line. So, Tara Hernandez, fantastic episode. Of course, I'll link the full episodes, all the clips that we're playing in the show notes as well. So I'm going to check them out in full. I'll link those up so you can click straight through. Right then, who's going to be your first highlight of 2024 then, Ravi?
Yeah, so this episode was just mind-blowing. I'm amazed that Mike actually came on, and this is Mike Fisher. I would have loved to have done this episode with Joe, because I think he would have gone absolutely mad, and he was kind of sitting there listening, absolutely loving it. And Mike Fisher's a former product manager and vice president of Sega of America. So we've had Tom Kalinske on before. Mike was talking about all the products, but also he was based at Sega Japan as well. So he's famously kind of got a bit of a celebrity connection. So, there's a famous pictures of Michael Jackson at Sega. Well, Mike's stood right next to him as well. And he's got like the inside story of what was going on there. But he's also got a unique perspective of all of the different divisions of Sega and what they were doing. He worked with Sega of America, but also in Europe, they were doing some pretty risky like marketing and stuff in the UK. And they did the famous sponsorship of the Grand Prix. And in this clip, he's talking about, Lady Diana's reaction to the sponsorship. Also the Sega magazines and how they turn up at the Sega HQ building, and it wouldn't be as nice and beautiful and amazing as they thought. But also, those rival products that got released at the same time. So you had Sega CD coming out, and you also had 32X, and there was all types of add-ons and stuff that started coming out, and his kind of attitude towards that and introducing something in the middle of a console's life.
And then I also, I had a chance to work with both Sega of America and Sega of Europe, which was fantastic. So I got a chance to see the different cultures. I got to see that incredible, innovative, product-focused team at Sega of America. And then, just the stuff that they could do in the UK. They did a Game Gear co-promotion where, forgive me if I don't recall if it was Playboy or Penthouse, not an expert on vintage softcore porn, but they did a product placement where the centerfold, the only thing she was wearing was the Game Gear in her hands, which is just, who thinks an ideal? I think incredible.
It was wild times, and they had the Sega World there as well in the Trocadero in London. I wonder if you ever managed to visit it.
That one I didn't see, but I was there when we sponsored the Formula One, the Sega GP. And I remember walking up right into Philip Lay's office as he was on the phone with the management of Grand Prix. And I remember like it was yesterday, he said, "No, I don't want John Major to hand the trophy to the winner. Why can't we have Naomi Campbell?" That was just their attitude, right? They didn't care about status or who was what. They just wanted what was cool at the time. And they knew what was cool at the time. Just an incredible bunch of people.
That's really interesting, because sometimes, people talk about, the Euro gamer scene and stuff, and it not being cool. But of course, that the 90s in Britain, that was kind of a peak of cool back then. And, Sega were really placed in the middle of all of that.
Well, there was a moment where Lady Diana was visiting some kids on a hospital and just started trashing video games. They're horrible. I wish kids could stop playing them. I don't remember all of the things she said. They're just awful. And we speculated the reason why was because a few weeks earlier at that British GP, where Sega was a sponsor, somehow they had managed to get a photo of Lady Di up in a skybox, and some race driver that she was rumored to be having an affair with in a photo. And between the two of them was the Sega logo. And that photo was everywhere. So I don't know if, Philip and the marketing team arranged it, but it was just incredible branding that you couldn't pay for any other way. And they were doing something like that, month after month after month.
And what was the kind of magazine culture like? Did you have much connection with the magazines, when you were putting products out and stuff?
It was funny because I would always be receiving them when they came to the Japan headquarters. And they were almost always disappointed because I think they had this vision of this super high-tech building and, people in white lab coats. And, our building was really dumpy and dirty. I mean, they eventually cleaned up and got a nicer headquarters. But we were in a crappy part of town. We were like this industrial section in the sort of southwest corner, nowhere near any of the cool centers of the city. And then most of the time, like, we wouldn't allow them to take photographs of the developers, or really limited what they could say in interviews. I remember one French photographer was so upset because you can't take pictures of the monitors by taking photos from behind. Well, you can't take pictures of their faces because we don't want them identified and recruited. He handed me his camera. He goes, just take your own photos.
I was wondering as well, as kind of CD technology came around, what was the impact like? And do you remember the first time you kind of saw the Sega CD?
Well, I do remember the folks behind 3DO, who, by the way, were also the folks behind the Lynx, Needles in the Can. Your fans will probably correct me, but they came by at one point and actually pitched the 3DO to us. I think our teams said, we can do this better and cheaper than they can. And I think we suspected that Nintendo was going to be doing something similar. And of course, I'm sure you and your listeners know they did and they didn't because of the partnership with Nintendo. And so it ended up a little bit rushed to market, and there was this sort of add-on component to it. And I've since become allergic to add-on components. Later on, when I was at Xbox and the Kinect came out, I was the person who stood up and said, please don't introduce this mid-life cycle. And I was definitely getting flashbacks to the Mega CD because you end up splitting your user base. Now, none of us thought it at the time. We just thought we had this unlimited capacity for content. You could have, compared to the limited memory capacity of ROMs at the time, it just seemed infinite.
So if you want to check that out, full episode is episode 411 with Mike Fisher. I'll link that in the show notes as well. Your first one then of the year, Joe, who are you going to go for?
Well, speaking of Sega...
I thought you might have a Sega one in there somewhere, Joe.
One we only did a couple of weeks ago, and kind of reflecting back on what I said, only a few minutes ago about, talking to the people who made the games that I grew up playing. This is Adrien Stevens, who worked at Disney and then worked at Sega Interactive. And I really, really loved his story. It was very humble, from having to steal food out of the fridge and eat watermelon out of the fridge and steal cake on people's birthdays. All while, kind of scrambling for work on Donald Duck in Maui Mallard, and then working on Comix Zone, which is a game I absolutely love and has such a cool legacy, and is included in pretty much every single Sega compilation, since it came out. But then to kind of hear about the background of it and how the game came about and how he was waiting for the Sega Saturn to come out and then how it wasn't, unfortunately, a massive hit at the time, was quite eye-opening for me to kind of hear the story from that side. But, once again, just hearing about that legendary game and game I grew up with.
The technology of the Genesis is such that you have to basically, you need some sort of tool to sort of like crop out little rectangles from an image in order to make a sprite and then animate it. And so I basically made those sorts of tools and things while I was, gearing up. So Disney's plan was, at this point, they were going to try and make the games that up until then they had been outsourcing, licensing.
Yeah.
They basically, they had Dave Perry. So he worked for some company. I forget do you remember the name of the company?
I remember he was at Virgin before.
So yeah, it probably was Virgin at that point, because I think Shiny was when he sort of went on his own. But yeah, so they were licensing these games. They would basically get, somebody would pay them money to make a game based on Aladdin, and then they would pay them money to, be able to sell it. And so they were purely a licensing organization on all that stuff. And they thought maybe they should be doing it internally so that they can get more of the money, I suppose. Anyway, that was sort of the pitch when I joined them. So that's why we were sort of looking at the Mega Drive and getting ready for that. And I think the next film that was coming out was Lion King. So the idea was that we would be basically making a Lion King game. So, we did a bunch of things to that end, but we were kind of waiting for approval from higher ups at Disney to say, yes, go ahead and do this internally. And I think they never really got that approval. And so that in the end, there was a lot of waiting around for stuff to happen. And that was when I got a call from the person who used to run Disney Software, who had moved to Sega. And he enticed me with what was ultimately going to be the Sega Saturn. Although what he showed me was he showed me video footage of their next generation arcade hardware, and said, "This is what the next console is going to be able to do." And I thought, "Oh my God, that's amazing! I got to get in on that."
Catfished you.
Yeah. So I went there under somewhat false pretenses, I will say. Ultimately what came out was the Sega Saturn, and that was like over a year, maybe 2 years later, and it was like a tiny fraction of the power of the thing that he showed me. So again, I had been frustrated just waiting around to make something at Disney, went to Sega, and was somewhat frustrated waiting around for the Saturn to appear. And to fill the void, essentially, I teamed up with Peter Morowick, who was one of the designers there, and we made Comix Zone.
Yeah, I love hearing that as well. I think because I remember seeing that game on telly at the time. I think it was on Bad Influence they showed it. I remember looking at that. And like you said, we talk about it in the interview, but the fact that it was very late in the Mega Drive's life, and a game that probably at the time was a bit underappreciated, but has now gone on to become a cult classic. And hearing the story of how that was developed. Yeah, really interesting. So for my next one, I'm going to pick Roland Perry. Now, Roland is someone who, I'll be honest, we've been trying to get Roland Perry on the podcast for God, how long? What do you say, about since the start?
Since like the first month.
Yeah, pretty much. And it has been nice to see, actually, that he agreed to come on our podcast back in the summer, and he's actually done quite a lot of retro events I've seen this year as well. So it's really nice to see Roland kind of getting out there and sharing his incredible stories as well, because he was the designer of the Amstrad CPC range of machines as well. Now, this little clip that I took off that episode, because actually it was a two-parter that we ran, wasn't it?
It was like a 40th anniversary of the CPC, so really good timing.
Yeah, and I remember when we were talking to Roland on email before we recorded the episode, he said, he's seen all the 40th anniversary celebrations of like the Spectrum and the Commodore 64, and he said no one's really talked about the Amstrad, so we were like, well, come on.
And it's such an underrated system as well.
Yeah.
The Amstrad, and it's a story that's not really talked about that much, and we absolutely love it. And we started to see a lot of Amstrad games that are being released nowadays as well, and there's a bit of a Amstrad little revival going on as well.
Well, what I loved about this is, you are absolutely right there, that it is a story that needs to be told more. And I think actually it is one of those stories that could be made into a movie or like a TV movie, something in the style of like Micro Men. It's definitely got all the elements that you need for a gripping drama. And in this clip, he talks about the dire situation that the Amstrad were in when the original CPC designers quit and kind of left the project in complete disarray. And bearing in mind they needed to get this launched for Christmas in 1984, the fact that they literally went from kind of concept to completing it in just over 3 months, and how he kind of rallied everyone together. There's even a story in here about when they were literally sitting in a pub and brainstorming the system on the back of a beer mat, and how, when he got the green light, it was like, right, literally all systems go, we need to get this on the market by Christmas. So love this clip with Roland Perry.
Best plans are laid in the pub.
So we were sat there doing our stock check one Saturday morning, and Bob Watkins from Amstrad, who's their technical director, turned up with his computer under his arm and rather glum look on his face and said, "Oh, this is our latest project that's come a bit unstuck. Can you help us out with this?" And that was and that's been documented in pretty much all of the books on Amstrad.
And that was the CPC project, right? And was that already underway? And what challenges was it facing? And what kind of steps did you take to initially turn it around?
Well, the main challenge it faced was timescale. A product like that, or a project like that, usually takes about 18 months from beginning to end to do the design work. You know, it's quite a lengthy process. And they were already about 15 months through the 18 months that they allocated to do that when the original designers decided that they were going to give up and go home. Amstrad had a business model where they actually had dozens and dozens of different items for sale. Most of them almost, have never really hit the public consciousness. A lot of them weren't sold as Amstrad things, but they used to sell blue jeans and electric kettles and all kinds of stuff. So they were, to some extent, a general import-export company. Every year, they decided that they would have a flagship product for Christmas. And it would always be a completely new product, complete surprise to the market. And in previous years, they'd had, for example, the twin cassette deck tower systems. All right. And then in years after the CPC, they had Sky dish receiver combinations. One year they had a camcorder. There's the emailer, which is, although it's a computer, it's not really a games computer. They had the PCW word processor, which again, it's not a games computer. And then the year after that, we had PC clones, which again are not games computers and aren't really even the same as the PCW word processor. So every year they'd have a flagship product, which they wanted to put into the shops for Christmas. Now, to have a product in the shops for Christmas, for people to buy for Christmas, it needs to be shipping in volume in about September. All right. So, because nobody buys anything in July, August, because again, they're all sat on the beach in Spain, but September, they're coming back and thinking, oh, what shall I buy the family for Christmas? So, to get something in the shops for September, you need to be producing them in the spring because they come over on a ship. It takes quite a long time. And to be producing something in the spring, you need to finish the design by the very latest the previous December. And to finish the design in December, you need to have started the design maybe 6 or 9 months before that. So it's quite a long drawn out process. And one of the things, that particular year, what they wanted their product for 1984 was going to be a home computer. Okay. Why did they pick a home computer? Well, there you go. It was just a kind of like a trendy thing at the time. So I think they slightly underestimated the fact that you can't design a home computer in 6 or 9 months. It's from scratch, because it just simply takes longer than that. So they contracted a couple of guys who've done some of their previous projects to design a home computer, and they went off and did their best, but came back in, I suppose, in July, maybe early August, saying, well, I know you said this has to be finished by September, but, we're completely stuck. We're simply not going to be able to do this. And so they just walked off the job. So that left Amstrad with a product that they were trying to launch in 12 months' time, which was basically, just a pile of junk at that point. So they came to us at Ambit and said, okay, you guys know a bit about computers. Could you rescued some other projects of ours in the past, mainly kind of audio wireless type products like CB radios and things. Could you do anything with this computer? And I said, well, as it happens, I've been playing around with these things for the last 15 years. So I think I probably could do it if you wanted me to. And I said, well, and how long, at that point, I wasn't completely up to speed with what the time scale was. And I said, well, how long have we got to do this? And they said, well, I don't know, until about the second week in December. Which point the question is, well, December which year? And I said, well, December this year, of course. And at that point, it kind of thinking, well, nobody's ever really done that before. But the challenge seemed interesting. And so what I said was, well, I'll tell you what, this does sound interesting. I know you're serious about doing this. And if I give you a design, you really will go into production with it and you really will sell a couple of 100,000 of them. So that's rather useful, because at the time, there were about 100 other small British designed home computers sloshing around, of which probably 90% never made it to market. And of the rest of them, they only ever sold about 5,000 in an entire lifetime, because they didn't understand manufacturing and distribution and marketing and things like that. And I thought, well, actually, I've got a chance here to be involved in a project which I know is going to get all of that support from head office to actually put it in the shops and sell it to people. So it's worth putting in the effort. So I said, I'll tell you what, I said, I'll spend a week. I won't charge you. I'll just spend a week. I'll go around to some of my friends in the computer industry and ask them if they'd be interested in doing this impossible thing, which is designing this computer for you in 3 months when it usually takes at least a year. So I just, did a road trip. And I went round and I saw people a lot of these people I'd known when I was at Cambridge. And a lot of them had kind of hung around Cambridge in the computer industry there at the time, which was sort of dominated by Sinclair, which was in King's Parade in Cambridge, and Acorn, which is just down the road from them. So I went round, I went to see some or not even I went to see some people who were still working for Sinclair, who were still working for Acorn, who were subcontractors to Sinclair and Acorn. I also went to some totally other people who I happened to know had been involved in home computer projects before, and talked to all of them and said, well, are you interested in doing this project? Well, my biggest problem wasn't my lack of enthusiasm or commitment to anything like that, but I was not allowed to tell them who my client was. And so if I turned up and said, well, my client is the BBC, and they, when this thing's finished, it's going to be called the BBC Micro, and it's going to be on television, and you're all going to be very famous for the rest of your life, they might have been more interested in it. Whereas all I could say was, well, I can't tell you who my client is because they swore me to secrecy. You just have to trust me that it's someone who I think you need to take seriously. And they were all a bit kind of, sounds a bit dodgy to us. And so one of the reasons why I thought up the name Arnold to stick on the original computer, it was only a keyboard, wasn't nothing inside it. I touted round was because that was channeling Arnold Weinstock, who at the time was the chief of GEC. And I thought that without actually saying it, some people might think, oh, maybe he's doing this for some branch of GEC that's going to produce a home computer.
Right.
Because they're a sufficiently serious company who you might want to work for, and more to the point, who, if you did work for them, you'd expect to get paid, which was very important. So towards the end of the week, I was drawing a lot of blanks. Everyone's saying, well, we believe you. And sounds like an interesting project. But first of all, we simply can't do it by Christmas, even if we dropped everything. And then we can't drop everything because we've got all sorts of other things for other clients on at the moment. So we can't drop all their projects. So drawing a blank left, right and centre. So my absolutely sort of last chance saloon on someone's recommendation was to go down to Dorking and talk to the guys at MEJ and Locomotive, both of whom, it turns out, are a bit of a loose end at the time, and said to them, would you like to do this? And they said, well, we haven't got anything else to do, so all right, you're on. So we sat in a pub in Dorking and drew a spec up on the back of a beer mat or something. And I then went back to the office, telex that off to Amstrad on the Friday, I think. And Monday morning, I got the telex back saying, great, go ahead.
So yeah, Roland Perry, like you said, that's from part one of an incredible two-parter that we did back in the summer. So definitely worth a listen if you want to get the history of the Amstrad CPC on the year that it turned 40. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Now, for your next one, Ravi, this is one that we did live.
Yeah, we did live, and I was so nervous. It's unbelievable. So we've done Retro Messa for quite a few years now, and they've had some amazing guests over from Japan. They've had the Final Fantasy team coming over. They've had some guys from SNK, I remember, and Namco. And this time they had Yoko Shimomura, and she's a musician and absolutely amazing composer from Japan. And they said to us, "Oh, come over and do the talks." We usually do the kind of British ones, focused on a lot of the British companies. We talked to Rare quite a lot. We've also talked to some C64 developers as well. But God, talking with Yoko, I was so scared. I was like, how is this going to work for a start? Because we don't speak Japanese. Yep. And it's going to be live as well. And it worked out really well, actually. She had an amazing translator with her. We pre-sent them over the questions, and we thought, let's try and get a bit technical. We're not just going to have the standard kind of ones. She said to us, there's certain questions in there where people ask, which is your favourite and stuff. And she's like, they're all like my babies. I can't say which one's my favourite, So it was really good. We got quite in-depth on this interview, and being able to do that through, a layer of translation was an amazing achievement. I think, this is one of my favourite interviews of the whole entire podcast that we've actually done, getting that voice of Japanese developers on. What did you think?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, let's have a listen to the clip, then we can talk a bit more about it, because obviously she worked on Street Fighter 2,
yes,
Kingdom Hearts as well. So what's in this clip we're going to hear?
So she talks about how she was creating music by coding it, and, she was doing it all through text, but also her musical influences and references for Street Fighter 2. She didn't have like a sound bank of resources. She didn't have, the internet or any kind of collection of wheeled music. She only had her dad's record collection, and that was a reference for all the characters and all the different kind of worlds that she created.
She's not sure if there was MIDI already existed, but she couldn't use that back then. Not her skill-wise, but she didn't know it existed. So she was using the MML text files to create music.
Right.
So she had to type the program to be able to make the sound say 80, 3, C. And that means how long the sound will be.
Okay.
The 80 is like 8 beat. Then 3 means how high the sound was. So it's like C.
Wow.
C. それを全部の音で書いて。Then C, which all the notes she had to do that for the same.
Wow.
今はとっても便利ね。
Now it's so convenient.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Street Fighter 2. When were you first aware of Street Fighter 2, and what was it like to work on your own solo project?
いつって。
So when she started, before the project starts for the Street Fighter 2, she actually didn't know it's like, okay, we're making this game and we need you to create it. It was more like she finished one project, then she had to choose one project from 3 choices. They had 3 titles, and Street Fighter 2 was one of the 3. So schedule-wise, she picked this one, and this was Street Fighter 2.
Good choice.
そう、例えばそう、そんなに、その時はそんなにヒットするなんて。
So back then, she didn't know it's gonna be this huge smash hit. So if we knew that this game is gonna be like this, then we will be fighting over the Street Fighter.
Yeah.
Well, with fighters from all around the world, how did you research the sounds and the melodies for the different countries?
さっきも、そのお話ししたんです。
So back then, as you know already, we had no internet. So she couldn't search, like, what kind of songs are they playing, or the instruments, what kind of instruments they're using in a different country. All she had was information from TV, or the Capcom has database. So that, then her father's record.
Okay.
So those are the information she got, and from that she soaked all of it and herself, and she created the world.
Yeah, that was incredible, wasn't it? Like you said, I mean, definitely got the adrenaline pumping, doing that in front of a packed auditorium over there in Norway. Like you said, having to do it via a translator, and just, someone at her level as well who's worked on incredible games. But what a lovely lady.
She was so open, wasn't she? Yeah. She was so open, nice and honest, and it was just absolutely fantastic. I thought it might be really rigid and kind of strict, but it just flowed.
Yeah, she was even there in the bar with us, wasn't she, on the evening? She came out with us all on the night. So, yeah, it was an incredible insight into, like you said, that's Japan was such an important player and continues to be, and it all feels like, because of the language barrier, it feels like we should cover that side of the industry more. So I think just getting a little insight into it with Yoko Shimomura was just incredible. So if you want to check that out, and I always love hearing those stories as well about kind of the pre-internet days, how different things were, and the lengths people had to go to, like you said, track down different musical styles and get educated on it as well. So definitely worth a listen. That panel recorded live at Retro Messa in Norway, and we put that out on episode 444 back in the summer. All right, then who's your next one, Joe?
My one's going to be Chris Block from episode 453, which was a really fun episode. Obviously, we don't always go for game developers, we go for tech people and stuff, but this one was a bit different. Ravi's he always wants us to get, think outside the box. Like, maybe we should go for like somebody who owns a game shop, or somebody in this case who owns an arcade, which I thought was really interesting. Not only does he own an arcade, he owns one of the biggest arcades in the world, and the biggest one in Amsterdam, which was really, really fun hearing about. But what I really loved about halfway through the episode is we talked about kind of his journey into how that kind of started, and how it kind of went from, making joysticks in his spare time to importing arcades from Japan and building his business, and kind of how a lot of these things seem to happen for a lot of these people, how he kind of fell into it, how it just kind of happened with his mum's help, and how he had to scramble and fill an entire like crate coming in from Japan, full of arcade machines when he only had one in the space of like 24 hours, and how, that just kind of took off for him. And, I just found the whole thing really, really fascinating, and just kind of hearing it, I guess, from somebody who was a consumer, their kind of point of view, and how they then got into the industry and, helped keep it alive to this day. So I really, really enjoyed that one. And thought it was a really great idea from Ravi, to kind of think outside the box with the guests as well. So.
I found it was fascinating as well, because you go to places like Arcade Club as well, and he was supplying some of the arcades for those places as well, because he's become like Europe's biggest importer of arcade units, and sending them out as well.
Yeah, man.
Sometimes I had like 15 orders, which was fine, which was nice, and you could do a batch relatively cheaper. But in the end, the parts were so expensive, and my price policy was not good enough. Then I was like, I can't do this. I can't keep up with this. So I had to step away. But a customer of mine who bought an arcade stick from me, he was like, hey, Chris, I found an arcade machine on, was it Alibaba, I guess? It's from China, and it's a Fulix. It's a Taito Fulix. I don't know if you know those machines. No, it's like a generic.
I know Taito, but
yeah, it's a pretty modern machine. It's a 32-inch machine with really good aesthetics. It looks really, really good. And I think they started selling those to Japanese arcades in 2008, 2009, somewhere, maybe even earlier. But he wanted to have one. And I was like, okay, I'm willing to be in the middle, but I haven't worked with Alibaba that much before. So what I'll do, I'll buy it on my own money. I'll import it and handle all the shipping and everything that's needed. And then you come to me, check it out. And if it's good enough for you, then you're allowed to buy it. You can even leave it here and I'll accept that. And if it's good, then you'll buy it and we'll get it to your place. And so that happened. And he was really happy. It was a great looking machine. And eventually it turned out that they were licensed under Taito to make those machines. So it was semi-official. I was like, okay, there's some margin in here which if I scale it up, I can live on. Because I didn't have a job anymore. It's 2011 by the time. My last job was my last job, that I started the business in. And so I ordered a batch of 4 machines and those sold pretty quickly. Did that once more. I had 9 machines in total sold. And to be honest, if there's no quality control in between, like Samsung selling TVs, there's always a guy or woman in China doing quality control. And if there isn't, then the quality control or the quality of the screens at least is pretty rough. You got like spots in there and stuff. The stuff that would be B grade, which would probably never go out of China, was in those machines. So I did everything I could to fix everything that was coming in, and it was a lot of work. So I was like, the reputation of made in China wasn't that good. So why don't I check out a way to get the original from Japan? Because those were actually built in Japan and not in China. And so I contacted, I searched online and found a reseller of used arcade machines in Japan. I contacted them, and I was actually, the first machine that I was actually thinking about importing wasn't the Felix, it was the Darius Burst. I don't know if you know that machine. That was pretty cool. It's a 4-player Darius game.
Yeah.
And and the problem with that is if you buy one machine, then it has to be in a shared container, which also means that they have to put a crate around the machine. And Darius Burst is like an 8 cubic meter machine, and and putting a crate around that is pretty expensive. So I made I did the financials and I checked what the cost would be. And it wasn't feasible. It was like 1,200 euros just to create the machine. And then, like 1,200 euros just to ship it. And then the cost of the machine and the import fees and everything. So maybe the cost of the machine was like 4 or 5 grand and it was worth like 6.
Right.
So I wasn't willing to take the risk. I was willing to scale it up to 2, but then the problem remains, it just scales by 2. And then the only solution was to fill a container for myself. And then you pay the 1,200 of shipping for the full container because the prices were pretty low back then. But you had to fill it, and I could take like 2 Darius Bursts, and I was actually talking to reserving those 2. So I was pretty hooked on the deal. And I was like, okay, how can I fill the rest? And obviously with those Felix machines. So the Felix machines, the control panel could be put in vertically. So the machine was like 80 centimeters wide and 50 deep. So the container fit like 25 of those next to the Darius Burst. Wow. Yeah. So I got a deadline from the seller. It's like, dude, I held those machines for like 2 weeks for you. You have to pay within 24 hours. So, not having the money, I begged my mom and it was pretty much everything she had left. Yeah. And, she was like, okay, but just get it back and do it. And, I paid them within the 24 hours, and within 72 hours, everything was sold.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That was crazy.
Like, I was wondering as well, our American listeners might not know that Rotterdam's like the biggest port in Europe. So did that help a lot, and just the infrastructure that was around?
Yeah. And it was crazy coincidences because I used to rent a place in somebody's home, like an apartment in somebody's home, and that guy had a huge transport company. So I went to him, asked him, okay, I'm jumping into the deep. What should I do? Full container load, this and that. And he helped me out with the whole deal. I had to pay it, of course, for myself. But he did all the logistics, and he had like 40 people working for him. So they helped me out. And they held my hand in the whole process. And that was really helpful. It was a pretty scary process. And I actually told my mom, like, okay, I'm going to get that money from you, but I'll promise I'll go there and shake his hand before we make the deal. And you know how that goes. I had to pay within 24 hours, so that didn't happen. So, I ordered it, and the whole process was a lot of work. Eventually, it's the shipping in Japan towards the ship itself, and then waiting for 45 days for the ship to come in. And of course, with your first shipment, you're going to vesseltracker.com, and you're tracking the vehicle, the ship every hour of the day, just to see where it is. And then, it went into the harbor. And then you can't wait, it's arrived. It did arrive, but it takes like 6 or 7 days to process, And then, he stored it in his warehouse. I took like a small lorry with tailgate and then, or tail lift. And then we, went back and forth to my place, actually.
Yeah, I love listening back to that. And I think, when we think about the start of the industry and, for a lot of us, like where we first experienced video games, the arcade, such an important player back in the day. So hearing someone who is keeping the arcade scene alive, and obviously he's a co-owner of Amsterdam's legendary Blast Galaxy, if you're in that part of the world as well. So definitely one for the arcade fans. I'll link that full episode with Chris Block in the show notes as well. Now, for my next one, I love this episode that we did back in the start of the year, back in February. And this is when we were joined by Dominic Wheatley. Now, he is an absolute pioneer in the British video games industry, co-founder of the iconic Domark. And we heard the story from him about how he secured some huge licenses back in the day. Domark did like James Bond games, and they had Star Wars licenses, and there was a merger with IDOS and launching the era of Tomb Raider after that as well. Really interesting episode. But I love this bit from the early days of Domark because the guys behind it were all like marketing guys, really. And one of their approaches to getting headlines in the early days was with a game called Eureka, which was actually written by Ken Livingstone. And they had this idea to promote the game of having a £25,000 cash prize, which, for mid-80s kind of Thatcher era Britain, that was quite unusual for the time. So we kind of hear about, how their background in marketing and how they approached releasing video games from a quite creative business perspective as well, and kind of capturing that entrepreneurial spirit of like the early 80s gaming industry in Britain, and kind of how that led to Domark's massive rise to fame in the coming years as well, and also how a 15-year-old lad won the competition and actually ended up going on to become a pretty big player in the gaming industry himself.
We didn't really have too much of a clue about setting up a publishing business. It was effectively a one-horse company, right? There was this game which we came up with, Eureka. And of course, actually, if you think about it, what was the defining part of Eureka? Well, there were two defining bits. One was that it was a prize of £25,000 for the first person who found that secret code, which, to be honest, was loosely based upon Masquerade, right? The Kit Williams, I think it's Kit Williams, book. At the time, which was very popular, find that he was a golden hair that he buried somewhere in an English field, and if you managed to work out the coordinates, you could dig it up. So that was it was an amalgamation of that, and of course we were introduced to Ian Livingstone by a fellow called David Bishop, who's a mutual sort of friend of ours, and we thought, well, if we get Ian to sort of author the script, then you've got that famous author piece, it'll be a good fun adventure game. Oh, and you might win a prize. And if you think about it, given that we were two advertising guys, we were marketing guys, it kind of makes sense that we came at it from a marketing angle, right? This is why we had this prize, that was our idea. It was really more of a marketing play than a sort of pure video game play. And that's where it came from. So actually, we didn't think about, we got to build this company's going to have 5 games a year coming out, and no, we didn't. We just thought, let's do this one thing, see how it goes.
Well, I know that game really put, Denmark initially on the map. I mean, obviously every kid in, every bedroom around the country wants to win £25,000. And I imagine they spent a lot of time So I think the way it worked is they completed the game and then there was a phone number at the end. And then they could call that for a chance to win. So, how did you go about marketing that then?
Well, first of all, just to be precise, we were pretty diligent about our plan. We did have a whole business plan, and we did follow it exactly. We thought it all through. We followed it. The phone number was sort of buried, and nobody was supposed to know. One of the programmers who made the game buried it at some part of the game. It was actually eventually found. That was buried in there, and the number was wired to a specific line, which was then wired into an answer machine at the house of our lawyer. Okay, so whoever at whatever time of day or night managed to find this thing, the idea was that they ring the number would say, "Hello, well done, you found it. Please leave your name and number, and we'll get back to you." And then the lawyer would check the answer machine, every day to see if anybody had rung in on it. It was a one dedicated line. And then, of course, when eventually it did happen, he was able to ring back and say, "Yes, well done, come and see us." So it was all kind of carefully thought through. But when it came to the marketing piece, we were just traditional marketing guys. So we were advertising in the Sunday Times. And we were advertising in these sort of computer magazines that were pretty fanzines, really. And we did leaflets. We did leaflets, and we did leaflet drops in certain areas, and stuff like that. It was all fairly sort of standard marketing stuff. And in particular, of course, we hired a PR agency. And they got us a lot of coverage in the Sunday Times, the Daily Mail, and all that, And it was very much in the mid-'80s, sort of Thatcher's era of entrepreneurship and so on. It was very much, 2 young guys starting a company and very exciting, and it's all in computer games, and so it wasn't hard to get the coverage in the dailies, and that sort of did put us absolutely in the map. Nobody else was really doing it. But here's the thing which changed from the beginning of our planning and all the way through to the launch. It went from being a mail order only business to becoming a retail business in the sort of 10 months from start to finish. It really was extraordinary. So everything that we planned was based upon mail order. Like get here's the coupon, fill it in, credit card number, send it in the envelope, and then we'll send you a game and a cassette.
Yeah.
Actually, we sold about 3,000 in the end that way. In the summer of '84, suddenly we saw Boots and W.H. Smith's started stocking games serviced by people like Centresoft and Leisuresoft came up. And then you had the independent retailers, the mom and pop stores, which were popping up everywhere, right? Selling Commodore 64s and Sinclairs, but also selling all the games in these little stores. And of course, they were supplied by Micro Dealer, which was this little distribution company for small independent stores. So suddenly we found ourselves kind of, coming through August, September, we're heading for a November launch, and we're like, oh my God, now everybody's stocking them in the stores. We're going to have to find out who the buyers are, and we have to go visit them.
Did you initially have some reservations about the home computer market and how it would actually go before it exploded? And was it kind of seen as a bit of a risky move? And also, did anybody actually win that prize as well?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question, no, I had absolutely no doubt, right, that it was going to grow and grow and grow, and for all sorts of reasons. And it wasn't just about video games, but actually you could tell that people were starting to use them as word processors. Yes, they were sort of doing calculus on. There were other applications that were starting to come through. So I was never concerned that these things wouldn't get. I mean, when we were raising money, I had potential investors looking at the plan saying to me, "This is a skateboard. It's going to be over by Christmas." And I'm like, no. This is going to be massive, and it's going to grow and grow and grow. So I had no doubt about that at all. In terms of who won the prize, well, it was a fellow called Matthew Woodley. Now, Matthew was about 15 years old, and he had been playing the game, day and night. And he finally found the number and rang it. So one of the fears that we had was that somebody would find it too soon, right? And it would all be over, the third day, and that would kill sales. Yeah. So we were like, it can't be won too quickly. But equally, we didn't not want it to be won. We did isolate the money in an escrow account specifically for the purpose. Because in those days, maybe it is now, if you did offer a prize as an incentive to purchase something, you had to ring fence that prize by law. Okay. So we actually had it legally kind of put into a little escrow account, and it could only be used for the purpose of a prize winner, right? Which meant that, if today no one had ever won that, actually I don't know about today, but for years, if no one claimed it, it would still have to sit in that bank account just in case somebody picked up an old copy and got an old Commodore out and suddenly, 10 years later rang the number. So it was gone anyway, right? The money was gone. So we kind of wanted it to be won, but we didn't want to be won too soon. And I think I'm going to say it must have been at least 6 months or so or more. I could try to remember when Matthew rang the answer machine at our lawyer's office, and bingo, he rang us up and said, "Hey, we got a winner." And Matthew's 15 years old. And by the way, 25,000 quid in those days. I mean, you could buy a house. And I think he put it to good use. I think he invested it wisely. He then, of course, used to come and hang out with us, right? So he'd hang out in the office in Putney, and we couldn't sort of shake him off really. He went to university, and I have a feeling we may have contributed in some way to his fees. I was using on the podcast. We could tell us. I think we made some contribution to his fees because the idea was when he finished university, he would come back and work for us, which he did. So when he left uni, he came and he went to the marketing department, and he grew his career with us for quite a few years, and then he joined Sega, and he became head of marketing at Sega. And I haven't spoken to him in a while, but I have a few years ago I did. I think he's gone freelance, but he's become a very senior executive in the video games industry.
Yeah, so what an episode that was. And Dominic was just really, really open with some amazing stories. So if you're interested at all in the British video game scene from back in the 80s, definitely a must listen on episode 416. So for your next one, Ravi, you're going big on this one.
Yeah, this episode is the power of patrons. This episode was bonkers, absolutely out of the left field and just amazing to do. This was Paul Hartnoll from Orbital. And we all know Orbital, growing up, absolutely huge, super rave group. And our patron Pete happened to bump into him and have a shared love of video games with Paul and said, come on the podcast. So we said, what can we do but have Pete on the interview, because he's an absolute expert in Orbital as well. And this is great as well. It's just, a patron saying, hey, there's a cool place that you can come and just chat about your history, but also video games. And it was interesting because Paul really liked the interview because it wasn't the standard kind of, how did the group form? The standard one that these people have done a million times. It was something different. And we were really talking about, him originally using the Atari ST to produce music and then moving on to the Mac and getting distracted with Warcraft, which I find really funny. He's meant to be creating these albums and he's sitting there on the machine that he's got to make music and he's like playing Warcraft. That
was a moment Ravi really related to, wasn't it?
Most of us would, procrastinating, but also how important the early internet community was. And, talking of internet communities, Orbitals was called the Loopers and they were really huge back in the day. And that community still kind of lives on today. A lot of the people in that original community are also now helping promote Orbital. There's an interesting story about how they kind of tracked down where he lived and then, found his family pub and stuff. But now how people are coming to his gigs and they're going together, and it's, brought people together, and it's actually turned into a physical community as well. And it's really interesting to hear.
So you had the Atari ST. I did wonder why you hadn't gone to Cubase, and I guessed it might be a budgetary thing back at the time. What did you start going onto a Mac or something like that after that? Or?
Oh, Mac. I've eventually got a Mac for the Insides albums. I did 3 albums on the Atari and then switched to a Mac, and I was very suspicious of it, so I kept it in my bedroom and would toy with it until I was fluent, and then I swapped it out for the Atari.
Were you brand new to the Mac then? Had you used one before?
Totally. Yeah, but then of course I discovered Warcraft and lost about an album to Warcraft. I used to go into work on Saturday. I say work with commas in the air on Saturday and just play Warcraft all day long. Yeah, and I'd think, I'd go in with good intentions to settle down to do some music. I think, go on, just have 5 minutes of Warcraft, and then it's like lunchtime, and you're like, oh bugger, I've lost half a day to video games. But that was an addictive game. Yeah.
I still have that problem. Yeah. I was wondering as well, when the internet came around, like you guys had quite a strong community and presence. Steve Price, aka Loops, had helped set up the community. How important was the early internet to you guys and harboring that?
Well, I was always quite skeptical in the sense that it didn't bother me. I didn't really trawl the internet. I quite liked email. I quite liked that. Again, that's that addictive thing, isn't it? I quite like going in the morning and see it and having the little chicken go, you've got mail, and it's like, great. But I never really used to look at the internet that much or think websites were that important. We ended up paying someone big money to do a website, and the first when they came around, they sent an interview around to get the biog kind of stuff, and the first thing they asked us was, well, when did you two meet? And I just thought, this isn't going to go down well. This isn't going to work well. It's like, okay, they've done zero research, and it was always such a painful process to change anything, and expensive as well. And then, like you say, in the background there was this fan website called Loops, which had far more connection with all the fans and information, and was just constantly updated and working. And then Steve ended up in Kent and thought, I know, their parents have got a pub somewhere in Oxford. And so I think he must have done a pub crawl of Oxford, but he found my mum and dad's pub because he looked at the jukebox and noticed that every Orbital single was on this jukebox. And it's like, right, this is
he was stalking you.
Yeah, I thanks for that, Pete. Yeah. He calls me baby reindeer, but it's yeah. And then he got chatting to my mum, and then we just kind of stayed in touch. And Steve's he may have been stalking us, but he's not a scary guy. He's on the level. No. He's brilliant. He's
a great guy.
He now does it for us officially. Well, we ended up sacking off our website and just said, do you want to do it? It's like, you're doing a better job. Will you just do our website? And he was like, yeah, great. And so, Steve ended up doing it, and it's never really changed, and he's done a lot. He does a lot of our social media as well, all the important posts of telling people we're doing stuff. And he just instinctively knows how to deal with the internet from an Orbital perspective. He's got it all going on, really, which is great.
Yeah, it's good. It's like you say, he's tuned in both to you and online and the internet and how it works and how to get people excited and the idea of building up this network of people, the loopers as they call them, who, although I was on that forum back in the day, I've kind of only recently discovered it the last few years. The loopers, the guys that are just so into the band that they've got tattoos and all sorts, and it's been great to meet them because they're such a nice bunch of people. So yeah, big shout out to the loopers.
Well, yeah, because I if I get the chance, I'll often because I'm always in communication with Steve. If he's going for a meetup, sometimes beforehand or whatever, occasionally I'll nip along, which is always annoying because everyone wants to buy me a pint and I can't have one because I'm about to go on stage. So it's like, it's always nice to go and meet those people. You get to know everyone, and it's like I was talking to a pair, Wendy and Tez, at the front of the stage, just about 5 minutes before I went on in Bearded Theory. You just go down and have a chat. Oh, you doing all right? Yeah. Anyone else here? And that kind of thing. And it's just like, it's good to be in contact with the people that do, use you as a method of travel. It's like it's like throwing the dice. Where are Orbital going to be? Oh, yeah, that sounds fun. Let's do that.
Yeah, I love this interview as well. And like you said, we had to have Pete on it. Because originally, me and you were going to jump on, but then we're knowing that Pete is like an expert in all things Orbital. And, he was great on the podcast as well, so I'm really pleased that we made that decision to have him guest hosting that episode. And there's even the stories about, like you said, producing music on the ST, but then Orbital's music being in games like Wipeout and Test Drive as well. So, yeah, that was really interesting to hear. So, just proving the variety of guests that we've had.
We have the occasional kind of DJ, don't we? And a musician as well. I love it. There's a lot of crossover.
You're always in your element there, aren't you, Ravi? So, really good episode. I'll link up that one in the show notes as well if you want to check it out. Who are you going to go for next then, Joe?
I am going to go for Mike Wilson, episode 439. Mike was wicked, man. Like, he was, there when Doom came out, and Doom 2 and Quake, and, he's in there with John Carmack and John Romero and everybody. And what I loved about him was he was a marketing manager. He was a businessman. But he was really down to earth, and he had some really lovely stories, where he said for him it wasn't necessarily like, oh, here's all my money. It was very much being able to go to these people and saying, here's a check, you never have to worry about rent ever again, kind of thing, because your game has done so well, and I've stopped, certain people in the industry from fleecing you and stuff like that. And I really, really loved that. But what I also loved, which was actually one of my favourite stories from this year, is how he got involved with, did you pronounce it Duango? And how he had to kind of like run around making all these phone calls to everybody to essentially make like telephone companies understand what Doom was, and people playing Doom, on the internet, deathmatch and stuff like that against each other, and kind of setting all of this up with all like the different telephone companies and stuff. I absolutely loved that story. I thought it was hilarious, and kind of hearing about that like early online gaming and stuff. And I love Doom. Everybody loves Doom. And you think when you've heard it all, Mike popped up and he had so many fantastic stories about it, which I really, really love.
It's not really an aspiration a lot of people have to be a business or marketing person, I don't think. Although, Bewitched was on television, and there was an advertising guy with a really hot witch for a wife. So, it didn't seem all bad.
Well, I was wondering what kind of education you had as well, and what led you to get involved with Duango.
It was my education that led me to get involved in a roundabout way, but it was in high school and college in Shreveport, Louisiana. I was lucky enough to go to school with Adrien Carmack. Wow. And Adrien was just a pen and paper artist that was like the guy everybody would go to if they needed something drawn for a T-shirt or for a button or whatever in high school. And he was kind of he looked like a stoner dude, like a stoner rock and roll dude, but he wasn't at all. Like he was in disguise art nerd, And I noticed that I had the ability to speak and relate to people like Adrien, or the football team, or the, whomever. I had this quality about me, whereas the football players would ask me to go talk to my weird artist friend.
You'd be like the middleman. Yeah.
On their behalf, which really, if you look at it, is kind of what my career ended up being, is translating between engineers and artists and business people and, marketing and finance and all of that, and somehow getting them to work together without wanting to murder one another. So I learned that in high school, I think. It may have been my only innate talent. And then Adrien, I remember in college, he got a job as a $5 an hour intern with these guys who had assembled in Shreveport, Louisiana, to make a game of the month for a thing called Soft Disc, which was a very early magazine shipping with a floppy disk every month. And John Carmack and John Romero and Jay Wilbur, and who else was it? Tom Hall. They were all assembled in this lake house in Shreveport, Louisiana, of all places. None of them were from there, but that's where this disc magazine was, and they had them making a game a month. And Adrien begrudgingly learned one computer program, I think it was MS Paint, so that he could help them make their pixel art games. And couple of years later, I got a call and he's like, "Oh my God, these guys just hired me. Like, I have a salary." I'm like, those nerds you were making games with?" He's like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I'm making $23,000 a year." I'm like, "Wow." And then like 2 months later, he's calling me with, he'd just gotten a $50,000 bonus. Wow. And then another few months, he had bought a mansion and a Ferrari. I'm like, "With those game guys?" So, and I had sort of followed along, like I would visit them every now and then while they were, I met them playing Dungeons and Dragons in their underwear in that lake house in Shreveport. That was my entry into the group. And the reason they trusted me when they were starting to find real success. And I was one of very few friends they had that they trusted that did businessy type stuff. So that's sort of how I fell into it. And when Dwango came about, it was this thing that these two guys in Houston had figured out a way to make people be able to play Doom against each other over the phone line rather than to carry a computer over to your friend's house, which was the solution before that. And they were super excited about it at ID, but they also didn't fully trust these guys. And they sent me to sort of investigate and sort of be their man on the inside. And that's how I got hired at Dwango and ended up running around installing modem racks in every area code in the United States as fast as we could so that people could make a local phone call to play Doom against each other. Because at the time, making a long distance phone call and playing Doom for hours would result in a $1,000 phone bill.
Wow. Those $50,000 bonuses sure go quick.
Yeah, no, but our new customers, these new people that were experiencing death matching from home against their friends for the first time, they were racking up quite a phone bill, often on their parents' line.
Yeah, I think, in terms of video game companies, they do not come much bigger than id Software. So getting an insight into it, I think, is always fascinating. And like I said, games like Doom and Quake, legendary titles. So, love that episode with Mike. So definitely worth checking out that full episode if you haven't already. Now, for my next one, speaking of legendary companies, are they still the biggest company in the world? They're definitely up there, aren't they? This is when we went inside Apple back at the start of the year as well with Andy Hertzfeld. Now, Andy was he's on the original Macintosh team.
When you mentioned Andy was coming on the show, like my jaw hit the floor. I was just like, oh my God, like so many documentaries and, films and just absolute stuff of legend.
Yeah, well, I mean, he wrote a book called Revolution in the Valley, The Birth of the Apple Macintosh, which gives you a really great insight into, even more of the stories that we covered on the podcast. And he's ran an incredible website called folklore.org that I've been reading for, God, must be 20 years. I've been visiting that website. And just, if you haven't checked it out before, it's definitely worth having a look at, folklore.org. Loads of little snippets, just kind of little stories that are like a couple of paragraphs of highlights and some lowlights as well of his time at Apple. But in this clip here, we're going to hear some of the kind of origins of the Macintosh team. And, there was Apple's famous Black Wednesday layoffs and how he was working on the Apple II at the time. And Steve Jobs, I was going to say convinced him to join the Mac team. Really didn't have much of a say in the matter, did he? I remember, Jobs actually picked up his Apple II and just kind of took it off his desk and walked off with it, didn't he? So physically moved him into the Macintosh office. And how it was quite a small team at Apple at the time, and there's a bit of kind of a us versus them mentality between the Mac team and the other divisions at Apple. And also hearing a bit more about Steve Jobs' infamous reality distortion field. And again, I mean, we talked about Netscape before. I remember the original Mac team wearing T-shirts that said 100 hours a week and loving it. Definitely part of the culture back then as well. And how, the Mac, it originally had a bit of the market was a bit skeptical about the Mac. And then obviously still a huge system, even bigger now than it ever has been. So I love this. So definitely a worthwhile place in our best of episode. Andy Hertzfeld with their stories of the original Mac.
Well, when did you first become aware of the Macintosh project, and how were you brought on board?
Well, I became aware of it when Bill showed me the prototype software he was working on. I came on board when Apple, a famous day in Apple's history was called Black Wednesday, when Mike Scott, the CEO of the time, fired about a quarter of the Apple II group suddenly because he felt that Apple had made some bad hires and it was getting bureaucratic. But my boss was fired, essentially. So I was sort of freed up. I had already become friends with Burl Smith, who did the hardware for the original Mac, and Bud Tribble, who was working on the software. And so I thought, well, maybe this mass firing is my opportunity to start on the Mac project, which only had 4 people working on it at the time. I was pretty disillusioned by the mass firing, especially because they fired a few people I thought were excellent engineers. But Mike Scott, who did the firing, heard that I was disillusioned. He called me to his office and said, well, we don't want to lose you. What can we do to make you stay? And I said, well, maybe I could work on the Mac project with Burl and Bud. Later that afternoon, Steve Jobs came by, who had just taken over the Mac project. And he asked me or I had a conversation with him. The first thing he said to me, are you any good? We only want great people to work on the Mac. I'm not sure you're good enough. He went, though, and talked to Burl and Bud, and they said, oh, no, this guy's pretty good. So he came back to my cubicle late on a Thursday afternoon, like maybe about 5 p.m., and he said, congratulations, you're working on the Mac now. I said, well, just give me till Monday. This was on a Thursday, late Thursday. I wanted to get just the project I was working on in order enough for someone to pick it up so that the work wouldn't be wasted. But Steve said, I told him I was working on this new operating system for the Apple II. When he asked, he goes, the Apple II, you shouldn't work on the Apple II. The Apple II will be obsolete in a couple of years. You got to start on the Mac. I said, just give me a day. He goes, no. And he went and pulled the plug on my Apple II, lifted it up, and started walking away with it. All I could do was follow him. He got into his car. He put the Apple II in the trunk. We drove to a little building, just a few minutes, about 4 blocks from the main Apple building. Took the computer out of the trunk, walked up to the second floor and dropped it on a desk, saying, here's your new desk. Then he just sort of disappeared. I started looking at the desk, and it had its previous owner hadn't moved out of it yet. The drawers were filled with all kinds of interesting little things like model airplanes and radio-controlled cars, toy cars. But it turns out he had put me at Jeff Raskin's desk, who he had just fired a day or two before. But that was my start on the Mac project.
How did Steve Jobs' reality distortion field influence the Macintosh project?
Well, Steve could convince anyone of almost anything, and that was an incredible asset to have. But of course, Steve also could be a pretty hard taskmaster. Steve's relationship to the project, he had corporate responsibility, so he ended up coming to the little building with the Mac team in the late afternoon, early evenings. We'd always show him what we were working on. He'd tell us, gossip or, stuff that happened that he thought we should be interested in. But he'd be very critical of the work you were doing. Sometimes he was kind of binary. Either it was incredibly great or it was awful. And there weren't very many points in between that. But he certainly spurred people on to doing their best possible work. The first thing that I heard, Bud Tribble coined that phrase, the reality distortion field, and he explained it to me on my first day of work that Steve would, actually, it was for the schedule. Bud was telling me what the planned schedule was. This was in February of 1981. We were supposed to finish and ship by early 82, like 8-9 months, which was clearly preposterous. I said, Bud, that's ridiculous. We'll never be able to do that. And he said, I know. I said, well, how come you don't fix the schedule if you know that it's way off base? And he said, well, it's Steve. Steve had a reality distortion field. He could, make things happen out of sheer force of will. And so, the reality distortion field, which is really just a fanciful name for Steve's amazing powers of persuasion. But that helped us transcend our limitations and work harder than ever. And finally, Steve wanted us to do the greatest thing possible or even greater. And we did it.
We've done quite a few Apple episodes this year.
Yes.
And I think we should do more. I absolutely love Apple.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of tech companies with a rich history, definitely more that we can explore there in 2025, I think. So who have you got next for us, Ravi?
Yeah, well, this is a great combination, actually, which is Mark Webbley and Gary Carr.
This was a lively one, wasn't it?
Yeah, and these were two names that, have gone on to absolutely great stuff. I love 2 Point Hospital and 2 Point Campus as well. I don't know if you guys have played them, but they feel like the old Bullfrog titles to me. And both of these guys are absolute Bullfrog legends. Bullfrog was one of those companies, of course, under Peter Molyneux that really stood out and created some just groundbreaking titles, huge titles. Of course, Syndicate and Theme Park and Theme Hospital. But then also, Gary started with Barbarian as well. So there's some great history here, and it's great to have two people working within the same company that can kind of play off each other and play off each other's memories as well. And in this clip, they're actually talking about one of my favorite games, which is Syndicate. I absolutely love Syndicate, but also how it developed. And, it was an idea that Sean Cooper kept going back to, and how him and Peter Molyneux, when they worked together, were kind of two of the people at the top of their game at the time. And, they were bouncing ideas off each other. And if you look at a game like Syndicate, it's so ahead of its time. It's so innovative. It had to just come from something amazing, and, real magic kind of happened there. And they both tell us what it was like being there at the time.
So in 1993, Bullfrog had one of their absolute classics released with the incredible Syndicate back in the day. I know Ravi's a massive fan of that, so he's probably going to really geek out with you guys about that in a moment. But I know, Mark, you worked on Syndicate as a producer on that game. So what memories have you got of working on it, and what were the challenges of developing that game? It was very ambitious for the time.
It was, and what I did on it was one of the conversions, of course. It was written on, well, in fact, it was originally being worked on the piece, the Amiga, and then the team, Sean Cooper and Peter, converted it over to PC, released on PC. So one of my roles was converting it, the finished game, back to the Amiga, because of course we were still supporting that. But Gary, I mean, you must remember, I mean, because that predated my joining of Bullfrog, and in fact, you guys were working on that when I presented my 4 Space Marine based game. So you kind of had something that was slightly better than what I had.
Yeah, it was like, to be honest, do you remember if it was called Syndicate then? I don't think it was.
Was it Bob or Quaz?
Well, there was Quaz was one name, Bob was another. The one I started was called Cyber Assault. So when I started on it, it was the very first thing I worked on at Bullfrog, because Peter and the team had gone away to a game show in America. It wouldn't have been E3, it'd have been something prior to that. And I was just given a quick briefing from Peter to go and think of a squad-based 4-player, actually it was 4 controllable character game, squad-based game called Cyber Assault. And he wanted it to be 3 sprites high. And of course, the characters ended up being very small. But back then, there were going to be quite large characters. And that got shelved not long after, really. We didn't do too much. I had characters running around a flat area shooting. And then we put it down. And what used to happen with Syndicate was it was the game we picked up and put down when something else came along. So it went through being a squad-based game into a sideways scrolling platform game, and it was called Bob. And it was called Bob because it stood for blue and orange bloke. And then Quaz. And then a game came out called Command and Conquer, I guess. It might have been what was before Command and Conquer?
Dune 2.
Dune.
Yeah. Dune. It was Dune. So that was the real kind of inspiration for Sean to pick up the game again and go, no, we're throwing everything away and we're starting again. Because this is really his passion was that game. And later Command and Conquer, which probably came out after, but it was basically Dune was also his influence, right? So he kind of started putting this together with Peter, and they basically worked in the evenings on it, not during the day. Peter was, I think at the time, doing the PC version of Powermonger. I'm trying if I'm getting my dates right. Maybe even early Theme Park. And it was Sean who was kind of doing a lot of the legwork, but with Peter basically coming in the evening and going, I like this more, I don't like that, and then getting into the coding with... They were a brilliant coding team, by the way, Sean Cooper and Peter Molyneux. They just fed off each other, smoked huge amounts of tobacco, and just worked late into the night. And that game was brilliant. They were both quite feisty people, really, with each other in a positive way. You know, they laughed and they were all kind of like challenging each other, whether it was squash or just, you know, who could code quicker and who was better at whatever. They were very competitive. And I think the game is that energy, really.
Technically, it's insane. What you can do on such a small system, and having such a developed world in there.
Look, I mean, those two were geniuses at that point in their career. I mean, you had Peter, who was probably the hardest working person I've ever worked with. I mean, he just didn't stop. And Sean Cooper, who literally could learn to do anything in about a week. I mean, he learned to play keyboards in a week. He learned to play guitar in a week.
I remember his guitar playing. I remember he got himself a nice guitar, learned to play really well, really quickly, and then gave it up because he said, I realised I couldn't be the best in the world.
Yeah, that's what it was
so
like.
He just gave up.
He became a supermodel in a week. Not kidding.
Yeah.
He did, yeah. He would do all these things. He was like a sponge. But I can tell you something about him. As brilliant as he was, he had no common sense or any kind of perception of what's going on in the world. I remember him saying how great it was at the time that we had a great Prime Minister in Margaret Thatcher. And it had been about 8 months since she had left, and it had been John Major in charge of the country. He had no idea that had happened, right? But no, they were fantastic together, really good.
It was a great decision to have Mark and Gary on at the same time, because in a lot of ways, it just kind of felt like overhearing a conversation with two mates at the pub, didn't it?
Yeah.
We didn't actually have to do that much. They were like just kind of reeling off all these stories and bouncing off each other. So it was a really interesting listen. So if you're a fan of those old Bullfrog games, definitely worth checking that out when we had the guys on episode 437 back in July. So yeah, definitely one of the highlights of the year. So who have you got for your next one, Joe?
I've gone for Dan Surmac on episode 450. We kind of, Ravi said at the start of the episode about how this year we did a lot of 8-bit stuff, we've done a lot of internet stuff, but we also dabbled in some of the consoles which some people might not consider retro, but are, PS2, Xbox 360 is 20 years old next year. So we have covered these kind of eras a little bit in the last year, and we'll probably see a little bit more of it next year as well. That makes me feel old, PS3 and Xbox 360 being 20 years old. But I loved talking about Saints Row, which is a game me and Ravi are both pretty familiar with, and kind of like discussing its comparisons to GTA and how much people would say it was a GTA clone, etc. And I love kind of hearing it from his point of view, because he was like, we started making Saints Row before GTA 4 was even announced. And there was lots of things in there that I kind of forgot about, about like multiplayer and stuff like that. And it was insane hearing about the budget differences between GTA and the budget of Saints Row and what they put the money into and how much multiplayer cost, and also when they were designing the game and they were getting test players, and it's like, okay, let's put the serious mode on, and now let's put the silly mode on where we put sniper rifles in it and stuff, and it wasn't even really, looking back, that silly, but that's what people were loving. And GTA kind of missed that a little bit. It was very serious, where Saints Row had the fun side of it. And I just really, really enjoyed hearing about that, because it's like, I was always a big fan of GTA. I was always a GTA guy more than Saints Row, but I've played the Saints Row games, and you know what? It put a real smile on my face and just kind of saw it from another point of view, and I really enjoyed that.
I was wondering then, with Saints Row, how did you go about the design and think what was GTA missing at the time? Because, that was one of the biggest games on earth, and there were so many like GTA supposed clones coming out at the time.
Well, it's exactly what we were looking at. We're going, geez, GTA is great, but it feels like they're trying to make a movie, and you're driving from one movie set to the other, right? One scene set to the other. And so you're driving through this beautiful thing, but it could take you 30 minutes of just driving around just to get to the next thing you're supposed to do. And we would see people doing cool stuff in the city, but none of it was thought out or planned. And it was so, well, why don't we make a game where you're focusing on just messing around in the city? That was really what we were thinking. It's like, let's do what GTA doesn't. Let's focus on just having fun in the city. And at the time, at the beginning, I don't think we were planning on missions, honestly. Then we realized you got to have missions for a storyline. And so we built them in. But our goal was just to literally give you a bunch of tools, a toolbox basically, and let you have fun in the sandbox with it. And that, that kind of idea, it was funny. People don't understand. They said we cloned GTA because they came out with a gang game. GTA 4 was a gang game. Well, we were already 2 years into production of our gang game when we found out what they were making. We would have not, it's like if we had started the game and seen that they made a gang game, we probably would have done something different. But we were already committed. We were most of the way done. The biggest thing we could do, we could change the color of our gang from green to purple. That's the only thing we could do to respond to what they were doing, because we were already fully committed. We were way deep into production. And so people were saying, oh, you've cloned them. And it's like, why do you talk? You don't understand production, obviously, because it took us 3 years to make that game.
Rockstar was so secretive as well. Nobody knew what they were. Well, nobody ever knows what GTA. I remember all the stuff for GTA 4 was just the main character walking down the street. Like, nobody actually knew what the game was going to be like. So for people to say,
they were so good at that. But I found out why, partly as we made Saints Row, the first Saints Row, it's like, we would make a neighborhood, right? And you'd build this neighborhood, and then you try to scale it up, like the AI for vehicles and all that, and it wouldn't work. You had to build the whole layout for the whole city, and you have to build up the city all at one time, and you can't do pieces. You have to kind of build the whole city up. And so there's nothing really to show until way late in the game. And I didn't understand any of that until we got farther into it and started realizing, wow, this is a different dynamic when you're building open world.
All right, then. So it's been great reminiscing on 2024 over the last hour or so. Into our final clips then, which, like we said, it's been really difficult to just pick out 5 each. So for the last one, I think I'm going to go with someone who, let's be honest, we wouldn't be here doing this probably if it wasn't for our guest that we had on back in March this year on episode 419. And that was someone who may not be, actually I think he's probably extremely undervalued. It should be a name that is on a lot more people's lips. A lot more people should have heard of Carl Malamud, because he was really the father of internet radio and podcasting. And I first saw Carl on an old episode of The Computer Chronicles, which, I must have watched like every episode of Computer Chronicles like about 5 times now. Love watching it, kind of that insight into, the early computer scene, taking you through to the early internet era as well. And obviously they're all on archive.org and YouTube if you want to check it out. And there is one episode where they're talking about internet radio back in, I think it was like 92, 93, like very early on. And Carl actually started his journey setting up bulletin board systems. And then he launched the first ever internet radio station in 1992.
this was so fascinating, this interview.
Yeah.
And, it's an area that I really didn't know about. And you really opened my eyes with this interview and having Carl on. That early internet multicasting and stuff is so fascinating, what they were doing back then. And, he's got an archive of a lot of the shows as well.
Yeah, they're actually all on archive.org if you want to check them out. It's in that episode show notes. But I mean, you think back to 1992, that was the year that, like Sonic the Hedgehog 2 came out. And, Street Fighter 2 was in the arcades, and the first Mortal Kombat, and, the Amiga 600 came out in that year. And the fact that he was doing internet radio back then just blew my mind. And he had a show called Geek of the Week where he got, legends like Tim Berners-Lee, doing some of their earliest recorded interviews as well. And then he put together the incredible Internet 1996 World Exhibition as well, which was kind of a digital World's Fair that, kind of connected early internet fans together. So I thought that was, just hearing his story in general was fascinating, and just kind of picking one bit out of this interview was actually quite tricky. But I think I'm going to go with this bit here where Carl kind of talks about how he actually did this, how he got an internet radio station up and running with those kind of early internet protocols as well, and how he did the digital distribution, even using stuff like FTP servers to, collaborate with ISPs around the world. And also when he saw the potential for downloadable audio that, laid the groundwork for what we're doing right now for modern podcasting. So fascinating insight into those early days with Carl Malamud. Have a listen.
And in the Internet Engineering Task Force, they were beginning to experiment with audio. And it was actually live streaming. It was really low bandwidth, low bit rate, not very good audio. But the idea was allowing people in remote locations to participate in the Internet Engineering Task Force meetings. And not only did we do audio, but we were doing video. And it was, little bitty images, right? We're talking 240 pixels wide for the whole video frame, and 4 frames per second. Right? Whereas today, you're looking at 30 frames a second or overdrive and, 60 frames a second, and you're looking at high definition, even like on YouTube, it works. But in those days, that's all we had. But it was interesting to see these meetings starting to have remote participants. And one day I was just trying to figure out what to do after having written that book, Exploring the Internet. I was at an IETF meeting, and I thought to myself, I could do an interview with people, and, rather than trying to do it live, why don't we pre-record it and let people download it, right? Because then you could actually have 8-bit audio instead of, 4-bit. Yeah. And it seemed like a reasonable thing to do. And so I went up to a bunch of people I knew, like Vince Cerf and others, and I said, hey, I'm going to do a radio show. What do you think? And they're all like, hey, this is great. So that's how Geek of the Week was born.
I was wondering, had you witnessed any of the gigs that happened? Because I know there was some live streaming and multicasting back in the days with M-Bone technology as well.
Multicasting was kind of going to be the way forward. In fact, the name of my nonprofit was called the Internet Multicasting Service. And I knew about, there were a couple one-off concerts and things that had happened on the internet, which were cool. And I was aware of those, but I was thinking more in terms of actually starting a real radio station. And my insight was that live streaming was good, but that was really hard to do when it was small audience. And so in addition to live streaming stuff, make sure you've got a recorded file online that's available. And so before I started the Internet Multicasting Service, I took another around the world trip, and I stopped by Amsterdam and Tokyo, and I talked to my friend Rick Adams, who ran UUNet, one of the first big ISPs. And I said, look, I'm starting this radio station. Can I have FTP space on your central servers? And what I'll do is we'll produce a program, and then we'll upload the program, and then people will go to you and they'll download the program from you. I also wanted to kind of socialize what I was doing, because these were considered to be really big files. A half hour of audio was 30 megabytes. And that was like being really piggish with the internet. It was kind of a scarce resource, right? We're talking, international lines running at T1 speeds, 1.5 million bits per second. And so if you were using substantial bandwidth, you kind of owed it to the rest of the community to let them know what you were doing. And in fact, if you did live streaming, etiquette in those days was you went on the IETF list and you said, hey, everybody, I'm going to be doing live streaming next Tuesday. And someone would go, oh, no, I'm already doing live streaming next Tuesday. You can't do it. And you kind of had to like give people advance notice that this was going to happen. And in fact, when we put the floor of the U.S. House and Senate online for live streaming, it was just an 8 kilobit audio stream. It wasn't that big. I got flamed by a bunch of people saying, look, Carl, if you put the U.S. Congress online for live streaming, pretty soon every parliament in the world's going to want to be on the internet. And there's just not enough bandwidth to be doing that. And luckily, Vince Cerf kind of chimed in and said, well, I don't know if that would be a bad thing.
I actually heard that, yeah, some of those early gigs as well, they would take up, quite a lot of bandwidth, and it would really, slow things down when they were performing. I think they were doing a few from Xerox PARC as well.
Severe tire damage, weren't they, the group? Yeah,
no, absolutely. You had to rent the internet those days. Not rent as in pay money, but you had to reserve your bandwidth. And if you didn't, you'd get flamed by people saying, all the international bandwidth being used by your silly rock and roll concert or your IETF meeting or whatever it was you were doing. So you kind of had to reserve that. That's something we don't really have to do these days anymore.
And around this stage, this was before technologies like MP3 were even around. So I'm interested in the process of how you recorded the programs and how did you digitize them for distribution?
Oh, well, that was, MPEG-3 wasn't there. So we settled on the Sun.AU format. It was an 8-bit audio format. We actually recorded on DAT decks. So we were doing 44, kilohertz recording. And there was a sound conversion program in those days called SOX, S-O-X. And it was written by a guy I knew who was working at the Mathematics Institute in the Netherlands, a guy named Guido van Rossum, who went on and developed the Python programming language. But in those days, what he was doing was this sound, exchange program. But it didn't support 44.1 and 48 kilohertz. And so I hacked SOX to add that capability. It was just a matter of changing a parameter, so it sampled at a higher rate. So we started with full fidelity DAT recording, and then we downsized it to .AU files so that it would fit into like 30 megabytes for a half-hour program, and that was about as big as you could get away with in those days.
I was also wondering, what were your considerations for people with different sound cards and different setups? Because, everything wasn't standardized back then.
Well, that was the deal. When you said, hey, I'm doing a radio program on the internet, the FAQ began with, okay, go get a sound card and install it. And, if you were on a DOS platform, you had, different drivers, and on a Unix platform, and you really had to go get the device drivers and get it so it could talk to the sound card. It wasn't a totally trivial thing. A few years later, sound cards just started being built into every PC that was sold. But in those days, you had to go buy one. You also had to download the TCP/IP software from a place like a bulletin board or get it on a floppy disk because your computer wasn't going to be able to talk to the modem and negotiate the TCP/IP protocol. So you had to install internet as well as a sound card to play in this game. So a lot of our listeners were people that had Sun workstations. Right. Or the kind of higher end workstations that you'd expect to see in a research lab like Xerox or at a university. There were a few people using the PCs. There was one guy that actually didn't really have the internet, but MCI Mail had an FTP gateway. And what it would do is it would break up the 30 megabytes into 200 individual MCI messages and send them to you. And then when you got all the messages, you would reassemble your audio file. And this is how he listened to Geek of the Week every week.
That's awesome. Obviously, you were the first person doing this. There was kind of no template either. And you think of traditional radio before that. It was all, soundproof studios and expensive complexes. What was kind of your setup in those early days of Internet Talk Radio? Did you have a studio? How many PCs did you have? How did it kind of work behind the scenes?
Well, we actually, I began in my house out in Virginia, but we very quickly after I started it, we rented a studio in the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., and we soundproofed the studio. So we had nice Mackie mixing boards, and we had DAT recording discs, and we had real microphones and headphones, and I mean we actually built a real studio in there. And because we were in the National Press Building, I kind of wandered upstairs to the National Press Club where they had all their luncheons. And they had people like the Dalai Lama and Al Gore and Larry King, would come in and do a 1 hour luncheon speech. And they had broadcast booths, and one was occupied by National Public Radio and one was occupied by C-SPAN, and the third one was empty. And so I said, hey, could I have that broadcast booth? And in return, I actually put the National Press Club up on the internet. I ran a cable from my studio up to the 13th floor and got them online. I happened to own press.org, and so I gave them a domain name and built them a website. So it was a nice fair trade. But as part of that, I was able to record all the luncheons. And at first we just recorded them and then FTP'd them up. And about a year later, we started live streaming all the luncheons out.
That's pretty amazing. I was wondering, did you have those DATs still and, have them in the higher quality?
The DATs are, I think, in my basement at this point. At one point we were going to go back and rescue the masters, and I think I've still got them. But, the AU files actually sound remarkably good because we engineered our patches on the sound, the compression and the EQ and all that. We kind of optimized it for AM radio because that was the level of sound quality we had available to us. And they come out nice and clean. I mean, they sound old-fashioned, but they still sound good. So I'm happy with the AU files, and we obviously converted those to MPEG-3 as well, and they're all up on the Internet Archive.
I was wondering how you marketed the station then in those early days and get the word out.
Oh, that was easy. You send email to the Internet Engineering Task Force list, and there was one other big list called Compriv, and said, hey, everybody, I'm doing a radio program. And so each week I'd send out a kind of a form email saying, on this week for Geek of the Week, we're interviewing Tim Berners-Lee or Steve Deering, the guy who did IPv6 and multicasting, was actually his PhD dissertation. And so they were pretty in-depth, technical interviews. But since we were in the National Press Building anyway, we added the luncheons. I put a satellite dish on the roof of the National Press Building, and we joined the public radio satellite system. So I was able to get syndication rights to Tech Nation, for example, which is a great talk show that still runs. And so we put all those programs online. And then we started helping out places like the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And we went in there and, recorded some of their performances, did some interactive things. Digital cameras were just starting to happen then. So we had our digital cameras to take pictures of things. And so we did original productions as well as, the podcast, Geek of the Week. And of course, in those days, it wasn't called a podcast. That was something that came along later, and podcasting is specific to RSS syndication and MPEG-3 files.
Yeah, so I always love talking to pioneers like Carl. So such an interesting interview, and I don't think he's bizarrely been the father of podcasting. I don't think there's another podcast out there that interviewed him yet. So should be definitely heard a lot more. So definitely worth checking out that episode. So for your final one, then, who are you going to go for, Ravi?
So I'm going to go for Darlene Lacey, and this interview was so different. It was really interesting. It was about a totally unique game that came out at the time, Dragon's Lair, which it was a combination of so many things, of different technology and different techniques as well. It was created with the help of Darlene, who was an art student as well, and they kind of used different new technology. When you first saw Dragon's Lair, what did you think of it?
It looked like a Disney cartoon, didn't it?
It just looked exactly like a cartoon or a film. And that was a combination of Don Bluth's studio as well and Laserdisc. This interview was fantastic because Darlene didn't approach things from a kind of coder perspective or a traditional like video game perspective. She did it from an arts one, and it's really interesting to hear how they kind of made it happen with that technology. Also, the limited space that they had to reuse scenes, they had to swap stuff over. They had not much budget as well. And looking at that, I thought it always looked like a really high budget production. And it's amazing how kind of cheap it was, and some of the cost cutting exercises. That's what she talks about in this interview. But also the first time she saw Dragon's Lair in the arcade and the public's reaction to that title. Well, I was wondering what the relationship was like then, because it was Rick Dyer Industries and Don Bluth Studios, and like how important was their background, and what was it like working with the two studios and the two guys?
Well, it was really stimulating, because we came in as the game design experts, even though, of course, we had no experience making a Laserdisc game. And Don Bluth came in as the animation and character and story expert, even though we were writers. And so, and then of course we had Cinematronics down in San Diego as the cabinet makers and the technology, and all three really had to work together. But it was really cool because suddenly we had, a professional animation studio working with us. And that's the sort of thing that, today with, gaming studios, they probably wouldn't think much of it. But for us, it was like, wow, we've hit the big time with this. And it was really cool to go into the Don Bluth studios and see the rotoscoping that they were using and other techniques like that. That was totally new to us. And I think those were probably some of the earliest or first times that those techniques were used for computer games. And of course, we were able to do something visually that was really unparalleled. And so it was exciting to see all that come together.
It was a great kind of transition. And I was wondering how the studio kept costs low at the time as well.
I'm not sure about the animation. I know we had a very tight budget when it came to the animation. And I know they worked around the clock with it. I think limiting the scenes and flipping the scenes was a major part of it. And really AMS, we were a very kind of, low cost kind of studio. Like I think people would have a hard time if they work in the industry today to imagine what it was like back then. Even when I was at Disney, we just had these skeleton crews. We had a couple of artists. We had, a handful of writers, game designers. We had a handful of programmers, and then, just a smattering of staff here and there. And most of us were college students. And so I think, Rick Dyer was able to keep costs down from that perspective as well, because we were all just working our way through college, but he had a lot of really talented people there. So it all worked out with that kind of, budget, but I think you'd have a hard time doing that today.
What about the sound recording as well? Because I know there was a lot of, voice samples in there and stuff.
Yeah, I think all the sound, it's a little hard for me to remember that. I think it was done by Don Bluth. At AMS, we had this attic that was always being repurposed for one purpose or another. And Rick put in a sound studio up there that we were using for the Lost Woods and our other projects. And so that was something new as we were starting to, delve into multimedia. But it was kind of funny because it was in the attic, and so it had this very low ceiling. And so some of our, staff were very tall people, and we would all have to crouch and get into it. It felt like, some sort of old woman in the shoe kind of, studio. So that was, my personal experience with sound recording at the time.
Well, I remember seeing Dragon's Lair in the arcade back in the 80s, and when I saw that game for the first time, it looked like something from the future, because every other game around was like 8-bit or maybe even 16-bit sprite-based games. Seeing Dragon's Lair, I wasn't aware that video games could look like that. So do you remember seeing the kids' reaction to the arcade when it first entered the arcades?
I do. I mean, it was incredible. And I won't lie to you, like when we were play testing the game, we were going to make it a 50-cent, a pop game. And it was so hard to play, right? And if you didn't know the design, you could die so quickly in this game. And I just thought, I don't know if this is going to fly. it looks great. But from a gameplay point of view, it was, really asking a lot. Sometimes you just had to keep playing the game until you figured out what the game wanted from you. So I had my doubts, and we put it out there. And as you know, it just took over the world. It was phenomenal. And I remember going to the mall and seeing just the spillover of people outside of the arcade. I believe it was Kingdom of Oz. And all these people were gathered around, not only in the arcade, it was standing room only, but outside looking through the window, watching some, players working their way through it. They had it up on a pedestal so people could watch. And that's the first time I've ever seen anything like that. And I actually have a binder that I kept of all the news clippings that were flowing in on our telefax, with all the, stories of, these arcades and the crowds that they would draw. It was astounding and really exciting.
So we've reached that moment then, and I think we could have easily gone on for another hour or so, couldn't we, with the caliber of guests that we've had on the podcast this year. But we have reached the final clip, and we'll give it to Mr. Joe Fox then. Who are you going to go for our final highlight of the year?
One last one, reminiscing about another game that I played, and incredibly lucky to talk to somebody who helped bring that game to our screens and helped warp my tiny little mind when I was a teenager. This is Jon Bunner, episode 428. The second time we'd had Joe on as well.
Yeah.
And once again, touched a little bit onto, more modern platforms. We were talking about Burnout and how it started off as a shiny red car and how it was actually based on a French film that they were, they had to watch like every single day. This is the inspo for the game. And the high expectations for not just the success of the game, but like the graphics and how the game would run and how it would look. And I think the Burnout games are absolutely fantastic looking games, as well as fantastic games for the PlayStation 2 era. And just, having a laugh with him about the crashing mechanics, that he introduced in crashing mechanics in all the games, but the mode where you have to purposely crash to rack up money and all that. Which was a game that I used to play on PlayStation 2 in my best friend's living room with him. And to think, it still blows my mind that I'm now, I get to sit in my little office at home and talk to these people about these games. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. And, like I say, genuinely laughing my head off about it throughout the interview. And it's just absolutely amazing. And, here's the clip.
But yeah, everything had to run, silky smooth. So it was a silky smooth racing game. And initially it was just about pure racing. And Burnout 1 was a very, very pure racing game with the Burnout mechanic. And I remember part of the vision for that game was a movie, and I've actually got it up somewhere. It's called C'était un rendezvous by Claude Lelouch. He was driving a Ferrari through Paris early in the day. It was, like a Ferrari 94 or something. And it is insane. And everybody had to watch that video because it completely captured the essence of Burnout. Happy to send you a link so that you can take a look at it. And it really does, to me, feel like a bit of that history because you look at it and it evokes everything that Burnout evokes. Yeah. And of course, crashing is fun.
Yeah.
Crashing is fun. And I remember when we were playing the game, you always wanted to win. But when you crashed, it was a pain in the ass, but it was always cool. And then I actually don't think it was until Burnout 2 that we started to make a fuss about the crashing. And because what was happening is that the designers, Christopher Roberts and Paul Cross, they were just setting up junctions, and they were setting up areas in the game where you could just crash. And they were having so much fun doing that. And we were having so much fun watching it. We literally turned it into a game mode. So it was emergent gameplay that came from the designers that we then turned into a mode. So that's where the crashing came from, because crashing is fun.
Yeah. And it was all about how much damage you could cause and how much money it cost to cause that. Yeah.
It's like, how do you score a crash? And the answer is, how much would it cost? That's a great mechanic, because you start to chain things together, and it's like, oh yeah, I just hit a fuel tanker, and that was a really expensive thing.
Yeah, it's amazing when it just keeps going and going. It's like, oh, the fuel tanker's now hit the big truck carrying all the trees, and the trees are now rolling down the hill and hitting all the cars. And it was very what's that film, Final Destination, as well, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. Was that before or after Crash Mode? Because they might owe some royalties.
It was around this. It was around the same time. I want to say 2003, 2002.
Let's not get too controversial.
Yeah.
I was wondering. You were saying that you were developing with renderware. That was going out to the GameCube and the Xbox. Was there like a time delay with releases, or did they kind of come out at the same time? Did you work with them at the same time and then release them, or do them separately?
I think probably back then there was some delay. It might have only been, a day or two, because you might lead on one particular platform and then just make sure that everything worked on the other platform. It wasn't, I don't know, or I don't recall it being true parallel development like we are more used to these days. So there was probably a delay. And also back then, any sort of delay, and I hesitate to use the word delay. I'll use the word timing. Any timing on those releases.
Really enjoy that little selection and showing off the variety of guests we've had on the Retro Hour throughout 2024. And like I did say before, if maybe you've heard a few of them clips and you think I didn't miss that episode, or like you said, Ravi, often people will dip in when we do episodes about their areas of interest, but maybe you might open your mind a little bit and maybe explore some areas of retro that you might not normally check out. Maybe some of these clips have inspired you to do that. That's kind of the aim of this podcast, isn't it? The best of, to kind of highlight some of the bits that you might want to check out.
Yeah, and find like common connections as well between some of the guests and some of the areas. You never know what it's going to be like.
Yeah, 100%. So if you do want to check out any of the full episodes, have a look at your podcast show notes, or you can head through to the website, theretrohour.com. They will all be in there. Nice little bit of listening for your Christmas break, hopefully. Right, speaking of which, actually next week is, it's the Mayhem episode of the podcast next Friday. It's kind of like our Christmas party, isn't it, the quiz?
Yes, and for 8 years now, I have lost.
I didn't want to rub it in, Ravi, but yeah, I think you have lost 8 years on the bounce. So you're going to make it 9, or are you planning on winning next week?
Probably, yeah, probably. I can't redeem myself with that. 8 years. It's like, I don't know. Maybe I'll do the fluke. It'll be like, the team that never wins the World Cup just suddenly coming through and getting into the finals.
I think Ravi losing the Christmas quiz is a Christmas tradition like turkey now. So it's got to happen. But that is going to be next Friday. We're going to have our Christmas jumpers on, crack open a few drinks. We've got Slopes from Slopes Game Room, who's going to be the quiz master this year. So Emmy and Joe are going to be on a team. We've got Paul and Ollie from Retro Gamer Magazine going to be joining us again. They're on the podcast every Christmas. And you're bringing a guest on, Ravi?
I've got a secret weapon that I'm going to bring on,
someone who knows their video games to help you out. So please do join us for that. It's always the most fun episode of the year. The Christmas quiz coming up next Friday. A reminder, if you're a patron as well, or if you're not, now is a very good time to join, because this coming Sunday, 15th, is going to be our Christmas hangout, which is where we basically have like a massive Zoom call. All the patrons come on, we all just geek out for a couple of hours, and this will be our final patrons hangout of the year as well. So it will be amazing to see you there. And all that remains from us is to say a very heartfelt thank you to everyone who's made this podcast possible throughout the year. Of course, our wonderful listeners, our incredible patrons, all the guests that we've had on, our sponsors as well. Thank you so much. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you for more guests in 2025.